All right, welcome back to our second lesson on variety in the world of invertebrates. This is chapter 21 of your biology textbook. Um, and last time I understand, you learned quite a bit about the group called mollusks. And so as I'm looking at the mollusks specifically, you want to make sure that you know, first of all, that they're the largest group of water animals on Earth. These include certain things like clams, oysters, slugs, snails, squids, octopus, etc., etc. And so for the most part, you basically just need to know that they have shells. That's going to be the thing that makes them stand out. Now realize that obviously some of them don't, slugs for example, but that's what we were saying. Now they all have three parts, and you should be able to say those three. If you're on 427, you can kind of follow along with me as I go, but you should know that they have a muscular foot, visceral hump, and a mantle. Visceral hump, viscera is simply a word that we use that means vital organs, and so the visceral hump is a mass of vital organs, and then they really divide them into several groups, basically bivalves and univalves, really. And so as we look at these together, you've got bivalves. How many shells does a bivalve have? You should be saying 2. And so even really in sake of review, if you look at 428, you'll notice in our book that they have kind of a survey of the animal world. And so throughout the year we've been talking about, of course at the top in the kind of blue-green section there, you've got vertebrates, and so you got mammals, birds, reptiles, amphibians, bony fish, cartilaginous fish. That's kind of everything we've talked about. But if you look at invertebrates, you do have invertebrates at the bottom, and of course the left side is what we've talked about in the last chapter. There's 5 different types of arthropods. You've got your insects, crustaceans, arachnids, centipedes, and millipedes. But in this particular chapter, you're going to have your mollusks. And really, the mollusks are the first group that we've talked about. We haven't really gotten into all the others, but throughout this week we will talk about the whole right column there. But this would be a great place to come back to as you kind of do your study. All right. So my question for you is, what is made up, or what is the substance that is secreted by a mollusk, specifically clams, that produces pearls? Okay, you should be using the term nacre. That'll be seen on 429 in italics, top left. And then, of course, pearls are just irritations or irritants. They get caught in the particular layer of the mantle. Of course, then the next portion that, again, I'm just going to fly over some terms. I can't point them out to you. It's hard to see. I could write them down or something, but of course the muscles that hold mollusks together, the clamshell shut, are called adductor muscles or adductor muscles. Moving forward, of course, they move simply by closing. Scallops move by closing their shells. Their movements are kind of interesting. Oysters don't move at all. Of course, they have a mantle cavity. That's the inside of the clam. In-current siphon, ex-current siphons, and then even further back you've got the different groups. So you had bivalves, then on page 430 we start talking about univalves. They have another name though. Okay, you should be saying the word gastropods. And so if I asked you to give me a bivalve, think of the things that have really only 2 shells. So you're thinking about clams, oysters, and scallops. And then if you go to 430, I'm talking about gastropods. You should be thinking things like slugs, snails, whelks, abalones, conchs, that's how you say that word, dowries and murex. And so it's not conch, so that's not how you say that word. Of course, they also mentioned nudibranchs. Those are the colorful sea slugs that you saw on page 430, bottom right. Talks about all the things that they have. Of course, they mentioned even the conveyor belt structure that slugs use to eat. Remember, that's called the radula. And so it's kind of like a conveyor that pulls food into their mouth. I'm looking at 431 now. And then we moved on to our friend the octopus here. That group is called cephalopods or cephalopoda. And if you're on 431, you'll realize that those ones are very difficult to distinguish into their head, their foot, their mantle, and their visceral hump. The head and the foot kind of are indistinguishable, and so they call them cephalopods. Again, we look at squids. We know the difference between squids and octopus. Squids usually have 10 legs. Octopuses usually have, octo 8. There is a little bit uniqueness to that. Circulatory system of a cephalopod is not open as in other mollusks. It's a closed system. So they have veins and arteries, all that. And then, of course, you've got the chambered nautilus on page 432, kind of cool mathematical creature. Well, that's our review for that particular section. And at this point, I'd like to get into our task at hand. We're supposed to get from 21.2 to 21.3. And so anything that isn't covered or finished in this particular video, we'll just kind of keep playing it throughout the week until we get through it all. If you go to page 433, we'll start off with the first particular topic, and that is the topic known as the echinoderms. The echinoderms. And so the echinoderms, first of all, it almost looks like the word echidna. If you notice it at the top there, you have the word echidna, essentially. And so echinoderms are simply spiny skinned invertebrates. If you remember what an echidna is, it's the monotreme, it's the mammal that lays eggs. And so first of all, we got a couple of things that we can note. First of all, echino means spiny. Derma, of course, means skin, and so your book says it means hedgehog-like, and that's helpful because hedgehogs and echidnas are very similar, both ant-eating and also spiny. Well, what would be included in this group? First of all, starfish, sea urchins, sand dollars, sea cucumbers, and brittle stars. Brittle stars look just like starfish, but they're much thinner. You'll see a picture of them in just a moment. I'll give you an example here. I've got a brittle star in this particular picture, and so you've got your starfish, you've got your brittle star, and then of course you've got your sea urchin and whatever those cool guys are. But these are all echinoderms. Now, all echinoderms are marine, meaning they live in salt water, and not just fresh water, but salt water as well, and all have spines made of calcium carbonate. Notice spines, meaning that, of course, they're pokey. You touch them, they might sting you. Obviously, you can touch a starfish, but you don't want to touch a sea urchin. It's not good for you. Calcium carbonate, that's limestone, but they, of course, are hardened. As we go through here, we'll notice that most have a flattened central disc from which arms are raised, radiate. Specifically, we're talking about like starfish or even the brittle stars. And so you've got the central disc. That's an important part of the anatomy. If you look at page 433, you'll notice that particular picture. I'll highlight that in a minute, but the central disc. Now, of course, all of these have what's called radial symmetry, or most of them do. And so, talking about their symmetry, they're starfish. You cut them in any way, they're going to look the same no matter what you do. And so that's what we're looking at. Now, I said radial symmetry. Here we go. Kind of top left of 433, after the word central disc, it says, as adults, most echinoderms exhibit a 5-sided radial symmetry. They come in a variety of shapes based on one design. All echinoderms exhibit bilateral symmetry in their larval form, and so interesting symmetry throughout their lives, but they are symmetrical in unique ways, and that shows design and order. The only animals with a water vascular system used to sense, feed, and breathe, and so particularly these creatures, the echinoderms, use water to pump their organs, so to move their arms and legs, using water vessels, and I'll show you those in just a minute. Alright, so let's look at, first of all, echinoderms. What are they? They're spiky, spiny creatures. Most of them are marine. You'll notice all 4 of these pictures are taken underwater. And so that's what we're looking at. Here is the anatomy of a starfish, for instance, and we mentioned that central disc. I think if you look at this particular picture, you will see very quickly. Let's see if I can get my pen going on a yellow. Well, yeah, let's try it. So this particular area here is what we call the central disc. Yellow seems a little hard, so let me go over here and get, I don't know, something dark like this blue here. So this is the central disc. That's what we're talking about. And you'll even notice these cool blue pipes going throughout the starfish radiating. Those are the particular water vascular system that are given off by these particular creatures. Try some more colors as I go. I think red might be good. Let's try that. So red, yeah, that'll highlight some things for us. Okay, but that's what we're talking about. So echinoderms are essentially going to include starfish. Starfish are going to be a better example, and so you'll notice the central disc and a couple of other things there. All right. Also, that water vascular system. So you'll notice the central disc is very obvious to see now, looking in this region, but also this secondary piping that comes through. You'll notice that there's kind of these bulbous attachments on the end, and so it introduces those to you, and so even here they fill with water, allowing them to raise and lower their arms and to move them and to create great amounts of pressure, really. And so That's the water vascular system of an echinoderm. All right, let's talk about specifically starfish. These are, of course, the best known. When I'm thinking about a echinoderm, this is one that's going to come to my mind. They do have 5 arms, or rays. Each one of those, if you think about the central disc and the pieces that come off of those will be rays. Now they do have an eye spot, which looking at several pictures was very difficult to find, but is on the end of each of those rays. And then, of course, they have jointed plates between with gills between them. So, of course, as they start to move, they can breathe or pull water into their bodies. On the underside are 2 double rows of tube feet used for holding, moving, and opening clams. And so I'll show you that in a moment. Also, by the way, some of this stuff would just be cool on your own time. We don't have time today, but just to go watch some videos of starfish just eating clams, it'd be cool. You wouldn't imagine a starfish to be very powerful, but they are. Connected to radial canals, which can come from the ring canal. And so that one that we saw earlier, we call them radial canals. They radiate outward. Let me go into some of this. Of course, you know starfish are able to regenerate their appendages. Looking here, you've got your starfish. This one, of course, is not underwater, and they can survive out of water. You'll notice the spines that give them the name echinoderm. But as we move forward, of course, here is the eye spot, a little bit easier to see in this particular picture. You will not notice that very often. You'd have to know what you're looking for in order to know what that is. But that's what we mean by eye spots. They are simple eyes. They allow them to see light and darkness, pressure, those types of things, but they're not seeing like you and I see. Now the tube feet are very important as well, so you'll notice even over here these unique suction pads. They have 2 rows of them on each foot, and so apparently they can change the water balance in their feet in order to use those tube feet properly. They use those to powerfully attach to things and even to eat their prey. So here's a picture over here of a starfish using its tube feet really to open up the mouth of the clam. And so you can see a clam here. We're opening him up. They can put on some serious pressure. I don't know if you've ever tried to open a clam before. When I was a kid, we would go into the river and we would pull out mussels, and I would try to open them up, and it's just very difficult to do. In fact, you can't. Not very easily. You can take a knife in there and get it out, but that's not fair. Then they can't do anything to stop you. So starfish have the strength, believe it or not, with that water vascular system to even combat a clam, and they're incredible adductor muscles. All right, let's move on. Also, it mentions how they eat. Apparently they eat by, the term was pushing out their stomach. They are trying to look for the term. It's a really interesting one that you don't see very often, but everting, I believe, is the word. Everting their stomach, but that is a starfish stomach from the bottom there. You'll notice the tube feet in all the directions, and of course the starfish stomach. Pretty interesting stuff. All right, so let's keep going. We've got a lot to cover. Rotifers. I'll just go ahead and say it right now. If you look at the 2 pictures on 434, they don't look anything like that. Rotifers are microscopic. It was very helpful, the people who wrote this in your book. They don't look like those colored creatures that you see there, but let me show you. First of all, perhaps they're the smallest multicellular animals. Multicellular meaning multiple cells. They are very tiny. Most microscopic creatures are only 1 cell, but they're multicellular. Now, they live in lakes and ponds, of course, because of a name like rotifer. It means wheel bearer, and so many times if you look at them, they look like little pinwheels spinning. Kind of fun. These were actually the creatures that Leeuwenhoek saw in the 1700s when he was writing his Micrographia. Over here, some, of course, are sessile, which means they don't move. Others are motile. Although small, has a complete digestive system. So one of the first things you assume is small creature, not very complex. But to have a digestive system is complex, and it actually eats. In fact, it eats in kind of a more amazing way than we do, even. Now, it does mention this term on page 434, right side, parthenogenic. It says, a rotifer has a brain, quite large compared to the total size of the organism, mentioning that. Connected to the brain are large nerves. Okay. Now, it says the sexes are separated and reproduction is sexual. Some of the females' eggs are parthenogenic. That is, they require no fertilization. And so the word parthenogenic means that you can actually produce eggs that will grow without being fertilized. Now that's unique. Usually you need chromosomal material or You need to have parts of a male and a female in order to form new life. And so it says rotifers, the eggs laid in the winter, on the other hand, require fertilization to be viable, meaning to grow into a creature. These eggs are different from the summer eggs because they are protected from freezing by a thick shell. And so just amazing little creatures. And even to think that these things have shells when they're cold and not. These are small. Let me show you what they look like here. By the way, they are important because they are kind of like filter feeders in the water. Of course, crustaceans eat them, and we eat crustaceans, and we like lobster, so they're nice. All right, so here's a rotifer. There it is. Beautiful. And so as you look at it, you'll notice, and some of this stuff you really just have to see in a microscope, you'll notice these little hairs that are sticking off of him. And if you ever notice, and you're watching this in a microscope, this entire section will just be blurring with movement. It appears that they almost have, if I can make this a little bit more graphic, kind of like chainsaw blades or like a circular saw for your house. And those saws with a center here, and they're just kind of rotating the saw. And over here, the same thing would be true over here. And so they have their saw blades, you know, going in, and those are all rotating from a center, kind of coming in. Now you can see where they get the term rotifer then. So rotation here, rotation here. So again, all food's going to go right in here. And so that's how they're eating. Now, of course, now I've made him kind of fun looking. He's got cool eyes and some cool eyelashes, and so yeah, he's a happy rotifer. But that's what they look like. Okay? And I don't see the diagram in your book at all, but I understand as a diagram it's pretty helpful. So make sure you know the parthenogenic there. Let's move on to the next one. All right, so that was the group known as echinoderms. Echinoderms, of course, are spiny. This next group is known as the coelenterates, and so coelenterates have a hollow intestine. Hollow intestine. And so coelenterate, phylum Coelenterata, hollow intestine. Now this includes jellyfish, sea anemones, corals, and hydras, and I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about these actually. Jellyfish, sea anemones, corals, etc. All of these have what we call stinging cells. You know anything about jellyfish, you don't want to touch the little tentacles of the jellyfish because they'll sting you. Well, those particular cells are called cnidocytes. You'll notice that the C in cnidocyte is silent. It is a cnidocyte. Most live in shallow warm water. Most of these creatures we're going to talk about do live in warm water. That means when you're there you can actually see the sun. Coelenterates have a sac-like body with a central digestive cavity. I'll mention that in a minute. They have cnidocytes for capturing their prey. Really cool. If you ever get a chance, you ought to watch Planet Earth. I was just watching that this weekend, just kind of the Blue Planet, the documentary that the people made of just all the sea creatures, and watching these particular creatures eat was quite fun. It's just a quick little documentary. It's a fun thing to just put on if you don't want to pay attention to anything else and watch some animals. Just be animals. So they do have two layers, ecto and endo. Ecto means outside, endo means inside. Ecto is kind of like a secondary version of exoderm. But they have an ectoderm and they have an endoderm. And they mentioned something called a mesoglia inside. That's kind of like their jelly filling. We call them jellyfish. Jellyfish. All right. So here we go. We got our phylum here. We have specifically in coelenterates, we have the phylum Coelenterata. And so you'll notice anything that has stinging cells, or hollow intestines, I should say. Let's make it more clear. They eat with a hollow gut. If you ever watched a jellyfish eat, they simply pull stuff inside of them, they digest them, and it's over. And so anything that has a hollow intestine, now many of them do have cnidocytes. Speaking of those cnidocytes, we have a tentacle with little triggers. When something touches the little trigger, it pushes it in. Okay, and then all of a sudden this thing comes out and discharges the sting. Of course, this is all microscopic. You would never see any of this, but looks very, very painful to me. But that is what a cnidocyte would be. Don't touch a jellyfish. Don't do it. All right, so speaking of their structure and their body shape, of course, all of the coelenterates are hollow intestines. Notice the internal cavity. This is where they'll eat food. And so many times you'll see your fish, happy fish over here. So he's happy, and he's swimming around, and he gets touched by a cnidocyte, and so it stings him. Well, then he's a dead fish, and he gets put in here, and so he's upside down now. He's sad. And so he's a dead fish. And then, of course, it digests. It produces digestive juices in here. Then Mr. Fish turns into little particles of waste that are eventually ejected from the jellyfish. But you'll notice the different layers. Of course, outside this outer layer, the jelly layer, is called the ectoderm, ecto. And then, of course, the inside, this particular layer of cells, is called the endoderm. And then everything inside, in between those, the word meso actually means middle. And so it's the middle, it's the filling. That's the actual jelly of the fish. All of it's clearly transparent, but that's what we're talking about. You'll notice at the bottom it says the mouth and the anus. Again, this is a one-way street, or I should say two-way street. It's the only opening to the jellyfish. Everything that goes in has to come out through the same hole. So that's what we're talking about. So there's that. All right, let's move on. So speaking of coelenterate a little bit more, of course they also have radial symmetry. You cut a jellyfish from the top, it's going to look the same no matter what. They have two body forms. Now this is interesting. Most creatures, like for instance, you get a puppy, they have cute, and cute. But when you've got two body forms, we're talking about totally unique design. And so when we're talking about a coelenterate, they usually can either be a polyp or a medusa. And so when you're thinking polyp, you're thinking something like this, something on the ground that's kind of attached to the ground. It's kind of got little stingers hanging off of it. Whereas when you think of medusa, you're thinking of the typical jellyfish. Okay, and so this one is on the ground. This one is moving through the ocean at the speed of sound. No, he's moving though. And so you've got polyps, a cylindrical body type that is sessile, notice not moving, and then a medusa, free-swimming umbrella-shaped body type. And so there's only two types, medusas and polyps. They actually can exist in either form. Some jellyfish have a life cycle that alternates. We call that alternation of generations. We'll come back to that. Now, polyps reproduce asexually while medusas reproduce sexually, and so regardless of the form, they have their different ways of reproduction. So here's an example. Maybe my pictures weren't good enough. I feel like they're basically perfect. But let me first of all get some of that ink off the slide so we can see it. All right, so we have our polyps. Notice that one, the mouth opens from the top, and on the other, the mouth opens from the bottom. They're exact opposites. So you'll notice that the mouth anus, same hole, everything gets pulled through this, and so all the food goes in through the polyp, all the food goes up into the medusa. But they are all the same creature. They all have the hollow gut, and that's what gives them that name. And so polyps versus medusas. All right. Let's talk about hydras. Now, if you look at the picture on page 435, you can see that this comes from that, multiple-headed dragon from Greek mythology, or lizard, whatever it was, that when you cut its head off, it grows more. Small freshwater coelenterate of the polyp form, so these things don't move much. They, again, have that polyp shape, and so polyps, again, have those little weird streamers that come off their heads and usually attach to the ground. Now, hydras are unique because of their ability to move, and so we'll talk about that for a moment. But they are polyps. Usually they're stationary, but they move by somersaulting, so you see on page 435 there's somersault patterns. Again, all this stuff you'd need kind of to see with the microscope. They also have a hollow gut. Asexual reproduction, they actually reproduce by budding. They regenerate if they're cut. And so here is just a moment to take notes of these things. So here is a baby hydra being born. You'll notice, first of all, the overall look of it. And then down here, you've kind of got this little guy budding off. That's how they reproduce. Again, the one on the left, we are not worried about the sea anemone just yet, but also is a coelenterate. We got that hollow gut. But if we're over here, notice the mouth that goes in, just like a jellyfish, the hydra there. Also, here's the somersault. This is what it looks like for them to move. It's kind of fun to watch in a microscope and see it. But there they are, floating around, doing their thing. Jellyfish. This is on the next page. We're on page 436. You'll notice the incredibly complicated life cycle of a jellyfish at the top of the page, but we'll talk about that in a moment. Jellyfish is free-swimming, coelenterate with the medusa-type body structure. So notice this one is the upside down, or the bell shape with the tentacles on it. Of course, it has the stinging cnidocytes. Those are stinging cells. The word cyte actually means cell, and so that's what we're talking about. Moves by jet-like propulsion. They actually have the ability to push or siphon water, similar to octopuses, through their bodies and produce a movement like that. So, of course, you can have a bunch of different sizes of jellyfish. You can have very tiny ones to very large ones. Now, they have an alternation of generation similar to ferns. I'll show you in the picture in just a little bit, but that's what that's called. Alternation of generation just simply means in one life cycle you take on multiple forms. And so here is from the Seattle Aquarium the alternation of generations of a jellyfish. So, of course, you have a jellyfish. So here's step one. Really, you could start anywhere in this process, but here's number one. So you got your jellyfish. Of course, he has his larva, tiny larva, settle to the bottom and form a polyp. Okay, so here is polyp. Here's two. Here's three. The polyp. So this is a medusa. Okay, that's a polyp at the bottom. So then they start to go through all of their forms. Eventually, again, still stinging cells. These are still cnidocytes. You don't want to touch those. And then, of course, eventually it starts to grow and bud. So you got the strobila. And it starts to strobilate, and then it eventually will form this kind of juvenile medusa. And over time, this thing will eventually become step one again. So we've got step 1, 2, 3. Here's number 4. Here's number 5, all the way back. And so you'll notice it goes from medusa to polyp, and this is the definition of what we call alternation of generations. So that is a jellyfish's life cycle. Now, this is what gives jellyfish, some of them, even the name immortal jellyfish, because they can kind of go on forever, but switching between these two forms. All right, of course, this one right here is the largest jellyfish, and it looks kind of small in this picture. You don't really have a sense of scale, but in this particular picture, you've got the same one next to a man. I'm looking for the name of this. It's the lion's mane jellyfish, and that thing is huge. It even mentions in your book that they may be 6 feet in diameter. This particular one that you're seeing in the picture may be one of the smaller ones. Of course, even Googling this just out of curiosity, you'll notice this was recent as of 2017. It said, did you know that the largest animal in the world is a jellyfish? Of course, here's the Latinized word there, but is commonly known as the lion's mane jellyfish. That's the one we're looking at. And it is even longer than the blue whale. Now that's where I'm just like, what? Because, you know, blue whales, they're huge. The largest known specimen was found in 1870 off the coast. So, of course, the largest known one is longer than that. So from our understanding, this is actually the largest animal in the world. Not on average, but apparently they can be longer than a blue whale. I'd like to see that personally. Wow. So let's go to sea anemones. Still talking about coelenterates. Coelenterates, again, having hollow guts. You'll notice on page 437 what we're looking at. And so sea anemones. Of course, they're called the flowers of the ocean. I'll come back to that. You saw some flowers just now. They're called flowers because they're named after the daisy-like flower called the anemone. Here it is. That's what they look like. That makes sense. And so they're comparatively large coelenterates with the polyp body, so again, they're attached to the ground. They do have cnidocytes, so they will sting you. Don't just touch them. Okay. Now, they do, diffusion of molecules alone cannot supply nor remove wastes. Jellyfish don't really need to have a blood system because they can actually just pull water in and out, and so they can breathe fine. Now, apparently, sea anemones need what's called a ciliated groove, and so in the tube of a sea anemone, so here he is, it's kind of like a volcano. He has little hairs on the inside, and all of those hairs are kind of forcing water inside. Those ciliated grooves are necessary to produce a constant supply of food. So all the water above will be forced inside, and so I'm trying to get rid of this ink. All right, so moving on. So there's a sea anemone. You can definitely see its floweriness. That's a very shiny looking one. Of course, here's a more helpful one. You can see why they call these hollow guts, and of course they do in fact reproduce as well. And so even more importantly there, you see the term ostium. We'll come back to that, but they have little sieve tubes where they pull everything in. So again, pulling water inside of the hollow gut and food materials as well that they're going to eat. All right, let's talk about coral. Coral is also on page 437. First of all, these are the first ones that are colonial. That means that they usually live in massive groups together, like colonies. Jellyfish don't. You may find a couple jellyfish together, but for the most part, they're just floating, doing their thing. You'll notice, similar to anemones, but produce a limestone cup. So an anemone is usually something like this, and it's kind of got its little stringies that come out of it, very polypy. Okay, but in a coral, it's going to be the same, but it's going to have kind of a rocky layer outside of this, and again, kind of filling this in like a collar, basically. And the entire anemone can hide inside of this. In fact, it can essentially disappear, and all you can see is that particular limestone deposit. And so that's what we're talking about. So that's the anemone. So similar to anemones, but produce a limestone cup at the base of their bodies, can retract into the cup for protection. So, of course, they do also have stinging cells. Eventually, the coral cups form vast limestone structures. So once these things die, they form these limestone structures, and we call those coral reefs. And those are massive structures underwater. Now, usually you'll find these in warm, shallow seas. In fact, if the water gets too hot or too cold, these die. They have a very small tolerance range. And so, of course, we have the largest one there, the Great Barrier Reef. So here's some coral. Just beautiful to look at. And so when they do, in fact, die, you'll notice the little limestone that's left around. Here are some good examples of those cups. These particular ones can hide inside of these cups, and they can just completely retract inside. And so just kind of fun to look at. All very cool. All right, and of course, here's kind of, notice from the very top of this picture, you'll notice the sun coming in. Of course, you'll also notice that all the living creatures, because this is a biome. I mean, things can live in this ecosystem is what I mean to say. Of course, here's the cup again. The particular creatures can live inside of these and do well. Of course, they're eating plankton, zooxanthellae here. All right, let's go into probably our last particular group, and this is porifera. Nothing says pore like pora. Okay, so these are sponges, something that's porous. I'll go through these very quickly. We do have, in fact, 2 slides of this in just a little bit of time. If we don't finish it, we'll start right here tomorrow. But porifera just simply means pore bearers. Now, these are only 2-cell layered bodies, and so many times with your sponge, it essentially looks like a straw in the water, and so it's going to look something like that. And really, I'm about to show you a picture before in just a second, or you make fun of my straw. That's what they look like. So actual straw. Okay, so we got our straw, and then inside, so the outer layer is made up of its cells. So that's one layer of cells, and then an inner layer of cells. Okay, so they're 2 layers, just 2-cell layered bodies, and we're talking about cells. That's it, just two cells thick. Whereas you are trillions of cells. Now, a sponge is always attached to something. They don't move. They're always sessile. Now, they do also live in warm, shallow water. Sponges are only multicellular animals that do not have at least a rudimentary nervous system. So they do, in fact, have to have. They don't have a nervous system. They're completely inept at feeling things and sensing things. They're just there. But they are, in fact, animals. All right, so here are a couple things. A lot of more terms in this particular slide, so I'll give you a second to note them. A sponge is a hollow sac-like animal with a large opening opposite its base. So again, at the top, it's like straw. The opening or mouth is called the osculum. And so, again, I'll kind of draw him over here, but here it is. There's your osculum, and then the straw kind of comes down like this. So osculum, we'll call it Oscar. Osculum. And so water and waste actually flow out of the osculum. Now, you would think that's its mouth. No, all water comes out of the osculum, nothing going in. And so water enters the sponge through ostia. So there are actually little pores in the side of this that water goes inside of. And that's how water enters the sponge. So water enters through these things called ostia. Now, those are the same terms that we used with the hearts of insects as well. So epidermal cells on the outside form color cells. And so I said that they were 2 cells thick. And so here's the outer cell, and then there's kind of this disc-like collar that's formed by little spines, and so this is what they mean by collar cells. That's what they're talking about. I'll show you a picture in a minute if you don't like my drawings. Of course, the mesoglia that's between the ectoderm and the endoderm contains cells that form spicules, and that's going to be a spicule is essentially a little spine that's made up of kind of silicates, gives it its structure and its strength. All right, so let's look at some of these pictures so we understand what's going on. Also, these things reproduce both sexually and asexually, depending on the situation. So here's a sponge, sea sponge, in the group Porifera. Notice this particular picture. Notice the osculum. Notice at the top here we have our osculum. That's where water goes out. Goes through the sieves of what we call the, sorry, I'm forgetting my term, ostia. Okay, there it is. So the ostia that come through, all these little holes represent those. Here's what we call a collar cell. You can see that color a little bit better. Also ciliated flagella that help move water along. And so that really is all that we're looking at